All right, it looks like we're live. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for our Pride Month. It's not straightforward conversation about domestic violence and sexual assault in LGBTQ plus communities. My name is Taylor Gleitz, and I'm a community educator at Denton County Friends of the Family. And I am joined by this wonderful panelist of some people that I'm going to let introduce themselves. So I'm just going to ask you to introduce yourself in the order that I see you. So Sarah, can you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thanks, Taylor. My name is Sarah Morley. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am the Youth Engagement Specialist at Denton County Friends of the Family. I work largely with young folks ages 15 to 22 with regards to matters relating to prevention of sexual violence and relationship violence.
Thank you, Sarah. Kitsia, I see you next.
Thanks, Taylor. My name's Kitsia Moreno. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I work here at Denton County Friends of the Family as a battering intervention and prevention facilitator. It's a mouthful, but I work providing psychoeducation groups to men and women that have been referred to us by probation, parole, CPS, attorneys for family violence charges. I also work at The Gracious Mind providing LGBTQIA affirming assessments that are more affordable.
Thanks, Kitsia. Jess, I can see you next. Can you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Jess. I use they, them pronouns. I'm an intern at T-Fund, which is based in Denton, and I am involved in some LGBT events around East Texas.
Thank you, Jess. And last but not least, Camian.
Thank you so much for having us today. My name is Camion Connor. I use she, her pronouns. I am the executive director of the Texas Equal Access Fund, T-Fund for short. And we support low-income women in accessing much needed abortion healthcare, as well as providing emotional support and financial assistance. I also am on the board of Pride Denton, which is the local grassroots org here in Denton, made of mostly Black, Indigenous, like BIPOC folks on that board. We center that community and we bring pride in a grassroots way to Denton here. So I'm very excited to be here.
Thank you all. So first question, we're here and it's June, it's Pride Month. So I would love for us to start off by just discussing a little bit about the kind of origins of Pride Month and the importance of us being here today to have this discussion. So, so what is Pride Month all about?
I can just do a little bit and other folks can add, because I think also Pride Month is very personal to folks in LGBTQ plus communities, so it can mean different things to each of them, but a little bit of an origin story is that Pride commemorates a march / a riot, which was a pushback from transgender folks of color living in New York City. They were at the Stonewall Inn, which I've been to, but it's like a gay club. And in that time, people would come and raid the inns. The police would come and raid them and like take everyone who was in there to jail. And this night they had just like had enough of doing that. And so they kind of like resisted police. And so it was really about reclaiming rights. Like, we have a right to be here. And it was also like against police brutality, which is an overarching theme that we're still seeing happen in our country. And it was our Black and Latinx transgender folks who like led the charge in that. And yeah, so that's kind of where Pride Month started. But I think it's kind of a way for folks in the queer community to celebrate who they are, which is what we say at Pride Denton. Like, one of the things we're excited about is celebrating folks who identify as queer and trans, especially folks like the BIPOC folks and transgender folks who have been historically erased from the history of the LGBT movement when really like they kind of started the charge. So that's what I got for you. I love it. I'm rainbow all the time this time of year. I'm not into rainbow capitalism, but I love the rainbow, the Philly rainbow.
Thank you, Camion. Does anybody have anything that they want to add to that?
Yeah, I was just going to say I 100% agree with Camion. I mean, I don't think there's much to agree on because it's basically fact, but obviously these voices, as she said, Pride was largely started by queer people of color, transgender women who kind of took charge when nobody else would. And so I also want to recognize that there are a lot of different folks within the LGBTQIA plus community, and we only represent a very small different faction. Each and every one of us probably has unique perspectives and experiences. And even while those experiences may work for us and may be representative of us, they don't represent everybody who is involved in our community, because there's a lot of different people, there's a lot of different identities. And that's one of the great things I think about Pride and just about our community in general, is that at its very core, at its very nature, there's this idea of diversity. There's this implicit idea that there should be acceptance for people regardless of who they are. They're people at the end of the day, and we should celebrate them for their uniqueness, for their identities, for the things that make them special and amazing people.
Okay, so Camion mentioned a pride capitalism. Can somebody speak about what is pride capitalism and just explain that for people who may have not heard that term before?
You've probably already started seeing it. It's this thing where when June rolls around or Pride Month rolls around, suddenly huge organizations have rainbow everything. Rainbow shoes, rainbow logos, rainbow fashion lines that come out. But it's very much, one, not inclusive of queer people in their creation of those products. Usually not very intersectional, so it doesn't take the consideration of other marginalized communities as well. And the profits to those things usually don't go to queer communities. It's very much like profit making off of the movement that's currently going on. And it's pretty common, and you'll see it, especially as some stigma, of course not all stigma, has started to be reduced around queer communities. It is now more profitable to put rainbow on a whole lot of things. And we'll see that with huge companies, huge sports companies. But the thing that really differentiates it is it's not in the benefit of LGBTQIA people. So the funds don't go to them, they're not involved in that process. Their policies are usually not something that is protective of LGBTQIA people. The way that they spend their money is usually not protective. In a lot of ways, it can be harmful. They can have policies that actively harm people in the community. And so those are the things that are not typically showcased when this comes around. And typically after the month of June is over, it's business as usual, and there's not a visible support of queer people.
Thank you, Kitsia. So how can somebody get involved in Pride Month?
Yeah, I can kind of answer that, but I also want to piggyback off what Kitsia said. It's kind of the tokenizing of a month. You get this month to be gay, celebrated. Here are some rainbows. And hopefully you'll buy our products and be happy with them. That's kind of what happens to a lot of marginalized groups who kind of get dictated, this is your month, this is your day, this is your week. It's this really shallow celebration of identities that basically throughout the rest of the year are either ignored, marginalized, or harmed. So it's kind of, sometimes for queer folk, it's kind of a catch-22. It's like, I want to celebrate and show off my identity and show off my pride, but at the same time, people are kind of co-opting it to write really not complete narratives about what it means to be LGBTQIA person in general. if you're really interested in looking to support LGBTQIA people or queer people or however somebody identifies, the best thing that you can do is all year round activities. You don't have to just save them for June and be like, this is the month I get to support my queer friends. Do things all around, support queer owned businesses, especially those who belong to folks of color, trans folk. Support those businesses, buy from them routinely. Advocate for your friends, for your gay friends, for their rights regularly. Pay attention to what's going on in your state legislators, whether that's local ordinances at a state level or federal. Pay attention to those things. Vote and vote with your money. Those are just off the top of my head too. I'm sure everybody else could say some also great ones.
Sorry, I was trying to make sure it was unmuted. I also say a big part of it is to take it upon yourself if you're not a part of the LGBTQI population to educate yourself. Because a lot of times what can be well-meaning questions or coming from a good place puts the burden of teaching on queer people, and they already have enough on their plate as it is. So actively engaging and researching the ways that you can be an ally, as opposed to putting that responsibility on the people that you want to be an ally for.
Yeah, I
Thank
think
you all. Go
sorry,
ahead.
I have a couple more. I was like, I think these are really great points. I think, yes, definitely educating yourself. One thing I would definitely say is like donate your money to organizations that support BIPOC queer folks. Like there are a lot. There's the House of Rebirth in Dallas. There's a number of trans orgs in Dallas that you could support with your dollars. You could support Pride Denton, which is a Denton-based pride organization, with your dollars. It's Pride Month right now. We partner with local small businesses and local partners and nonprofits to like pull off Pride. So we don't do the big corporate Budweiser type situation here, because that's not really what Denton's about, in our opinion. So like we partner with local businesses. And so I would say also support the local businesses that are supporting queer folks and creating safe spaces for queer folks, but also advocate with those businesses. I think part of our learning around throwing Pride in Denton is that we have been able to create relationships with local business owners and educate them and move them along the way. So like talk to them about their bathrooms. Are they gender neutral? Are they accessible? Like all of those things really matter. The diversity of their staff, you know, like pay attention to those things and support organizations that are supporting our community members.
Thank you all. Jess, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. I just wanted to add that I feel that there are ways that you can support like your LGBT peers or friends. Like just through small actions. For example, I'm like collecting bottle caps to make pins out of that we can, that my friends and I can like wear throughout Pride Month. And then you can also just like speak out whenever you hear discrimination happening, and just protecting them in spaces that they might not feel all that comfortable.
So today we're going to be talking about domestic violence and sexual assault within LGBTQ plus communities. Why is that an important conversation to have?
Well, when it comes to what we know about domestic violence, sexual assault, it's not talked enough about in any relationships. Oftentimes these are issues that get swept under the rug. Maybe they're considered family matters, or they're not things that we talk about in private. So domestic violence, sexual assault awareness in and of itself is something that is often silenced, but especially when we're talking about a group, a marginalized group like the LGBTQIA plus folks, there's even more compounding factors that make discussing these kind of topics really difficult or maybe more challenging. And these are both issues that happen within the individual relationship, but they're also societal perceptions, how people understand or think of LGBTQIA people or non-gender conforming people or non-binary folk. There's a lot of societal factors that really kind of molds that relationship and maybe molds how people respond to violence in that relationship.
There are just a couple of things that I thought about personally for myself, like I identify as a queer person, um, and it not having a lot of models for healthy relationships in general in my life as a child, but definitely like zero models for healthy relationships of folks that might be of the same gender or a healthy relationship with someone that was transgender. Like when I grew up, I didn't know anyone that was transgender until I came to college. So I think that can make it hard because a lot of folks in these communities might not be in families with other queer folks. So like, where do we see those kinds of relationships being modeled? And when it comes to like communication, but also when it comes to like sexual gratification and like what you're supposed to expect and what you can ask for and what you can say no to, like those things weren't talked to me about in school around anything except cis hetero relationships, if it was talked about at all. So I think that is something that's super important, as well as if folks, like I wasn't out, there's a whole thing about like being out in college but not out at home. So it's very much like, oh, the people that I went to college with knew I was out, but my family at home, like when I went to visit, they didn't know I was out. So that makes it hard around a support system if you're in a relationship of violence or a harmful relationship at all. Like it makes it hard to rely on your support system if they already aren't supporting your relationship choices or the relationship or how you identify. So I think that that's another great reason for us to have this conversation, is just because we need open lines of communication about this stuff. Like it needs to be more top of mind and people need to be more well-versed in like talking to anyone about healthy, safe relationships, no matter what type of relationship it is, including polyamorous ones. I want to throw that in.
Yeah, and I think adding to that, there's so much violence that the LGBTQI population already faces. So adding intimate partner violence into that, a topic that, as Sarah mentioned, is already kind of stigmatized to talk about in heterosexual relationships, but compounding that with the isolation that can come with being out or not being out in some spaces, in addition to police violence, violence within your community, family violence that also occurs outside of intimate partner violence. All of those things are not only really compounded, but also very like under researched, underreported. And there's not a lot of funding in the area of looking at what these trends actually are. Like our numbers are representative of one thing and they're high, but even that doesn't capture the full story. So I think that also really highlights why this is an important conversation to be having.
All right, thank you all. So we've been using some terms, so just breaking down for people who maybe don't know, can you speak just quickly about who all is included in the term like LGBTQ plus? Sometimes you hear LGBTQIA plus. What are these terms for people who don't know?
I can go through a couple of them if anybody wants to piggyback. Okay, so I don't necessarily want to define each one, but I can say what they are. Okay, so LGBTQIA plus is what I usually use. So I'll go with that. The L stands for lesbian. The G stands for gay. The B stands for bisexual. The T stands for transgender. The Q is queer. Some people put another Q and say it's questioning, but it can be captured in the plus. The A stands for asexuals. There's a lot of ace identified folks in the queer community. And that's a spectrum also. So just like do a little research around that. And the I stands for intersex folks, of which there are many folks in the community. And I would say that like in some, the plus is like a, I don't want to say a catch-all, but it's like a, you are also welcome here. That's what I think. It's a plus to have you on our side. I know that Folks make a lot of jokes about this being alphabet soup, which I don't really love. But what I do love about the queer community is that, like, yeah, there's a lot of us, and we're adding on and we're bringing in more folks because all we want to do is create spaces where people feel affirmed for who they are. And so I think it's great to like adapt in that way. I don't think it's necessarily a joke or anything bad. Anyone else can feel free to add.
Yeah, I've definitely heard it's kind of an alphabet joke. It's like, oh, how many letters are you going to put in there? Honestly, for me, if they keep adding letters, I'll keep saying letters. I'm not going to stop until like everybody feels represented and everyone feels like they can belong in this community. For me, myself, I identify as a lesbian. I've been with my partner now for almost 8 years, and I want anybody who doesn't feel like they belong, whether it has something to do with their sexuality, orientation, gender expression. I think the LGBTQI plus community at its core, as I said earlier, should be about acceptance, love, and diversity and inclusion. I know when sometimes people talk about the LGBTQI plus community, sometimes they include the number 2 for folks who identify as two-spirited in the Native American community. And also, I think for different countries, sometimes they'll add different letters for different identities. But largely, I think when we say LGBTQIA+, we're largely, I think, just in general, and this is not like a specific thing, we're largely talking about folks who maybe don't identify as strictly heterosexual or don't identify as traditionally strictly heterosexual, and those who don't maybe strictly identify as cisgender. And for those folks who are interested in what cisgender means, cisgender is essentially when your biology, so maybe your hormones, your DNA, your physical anatomy, traditionally matches with your gender identity. So if you're born biologically male and you identify as a man, those are folks that we would generally call cisgender. But of course, just as in the LGBTQIA plus community, there's a lot of different folks who may fall somewhere on the spectrum and who may not be strictly cisgender or who may identify as strictly cisgender. It's really up to the person and how they feel about themselves and what feels most comfortable for them.
I'd also like to say sometimes I see a P, which I think usually stands for pansexual, but I've heard sometimes that there's 2 Ps for pansexual and polyamory. So I wanted to make sure I added that, and that you'll probably hear me say queer a lot because I use queer as an overall identifier for everyone. So that we usually use queer and trans when we talk about it at Pride Denton. Yeah, but I agree with what Sarah said.
And then just a quick summary of what is the kind of boiled down difference between sex and gender. When we talk about gender messages here in a minute, I want people to understand where we're coming at with these terms.
I can piggyback off of that because I think Sarah already touched on it a little bit, so I'll steal your words. Sex very much refers to like the biological attributes. So like, does this person, were they born with, what can be identified as a penis? Were they born with ovaries? What is their genetic makeup? What is their reproductive system look like? And even that can be very, very, very subjective to the point that I don't know if it's still a thing, I'm sure it is, but like the phallometer, like you would measure like how long is this thing and is it long enough to be a penis or short enough to be a clit? And if it's not, let's make those adjustments. So it can be even that both inhumane and also trivial. And then gender refers to kind of that socially constructed things that we ascribe femininity to something, we ascribe masculinity to something. In our like American society, it's very binary. So it tends to be like either this is feminine or this is masculine, and we have much less like cognitive flexibility to see it as a spectrum. But that can kind of be like a boiled down way to look at it. And it can be difficult concepts to grasp because sometimes we have the tendency to ascribe gender to sex. It's just the way kind of we've been socially brought up. And so starting to tease those things apart can be difficult. And sometimes if you're a visual person and you've heard of the gender unicorn, if you haven't, you can Google it. It's kind of a very visual way to see how those things are different from each other and how they may show up differently in people, and how they're all exist on a spectrum and are not as binary as we might want them to be.
Yeah, just going off that what Kitsia said, historically, in at least the Western world in the United States, we have largely divided people into two sexes, male, female, and then two genders, men and women. But as we come to know science more, as we come to better understand the human body, as we better begin to understand people, we've kind of learned that we all somewhere fit along this spectrum. And as individuals, we get to decide that for ourselves. We could decide how we identify for ourselves. But oftentimes there's a lot of societal pressure to fit into either a male masculine box or a female feminine box. And so sometimes that pressure can lead people to maybe questioning who they are, making people doubt themselves. It can lead to things like low self-esteem, low self-worth, which are largely prevalent in the LGBTQA community because that's what we've been told. We've been told if you're a woman, you'll marry a man. If you're a man, you'll marry a woman. You'll have kids. That's the story that's being told, and that's the story being pushed by society. And so those are things that people adopt. Those are things that LGBTQA people adopt while still feeling this dissonance within themselves of saying, this doesn't fit for me, this doesn't feel right.
Thank you. Jess, I want to give you a chance to have some space. Can you explain what gender socialization is? So when we say gender is beliefs we have about what it means to be a man or a woman, can you explain that a bit?
Yes. So I guess whenever you are young, you're essentially like brought up to, I guess, hold certain like social norms because of what you were assigned at birth. What was the rest of the question? I'm very sorry.
What is gender socialization? So
Okay.
I think you're.
Yeah. So that goes on to like affect the rest of your life as well. It essentially like defines who you're supposed to marry and what sort of life you're supposed to lead, what you're supposed to do in the home, and what you're supposed to like look like, dress like, and ways in which you're supposed to behave. Mm-hmm.
Perfect. So what are some of the assumptions that we make about gender, and how might those assumptions relate to domestic and sexual violence?
Yeah. So I feel like specifically with gender, you're basically cast into a role whenever you're in a relationship. Like and you're supposed to like fulfill certain relationship norms because of the role that you've been cast into. And I feel like that can be harmful for LGBT people because I feel like Sarah and Kitsia had said this before. You're essentially just being cast into a box without having any say in who you are or how you identify.
Yeah, and again, I love to piggyback off someone, so I'll piggyback off Jess. These boxes contain really prominent messages that we're told, as Jess said, throughout our entire lives. We are receiving these messages. Even if we're able to recognize them and say, well, that message doesn't fit for me, it's still like subconsciously getting filed away in our brain of this is what's normal or this is what's not, quote unquote, normal. When it comes to, if we just talk about the gender binary, when it comes to talking about men and women, men are often stereotyped or socialized maybe to be aggressive, to be the provider of the home, to be the protector, to drive trucks, wear blue jeans. Oftentimes men get told to be very muscular, very quote unquote like rough in appearance and how they act, while women are told almost an exact opposite message. So it's something you need to be feminine, so you need to be submissive, polite, you need to look a certain way, your body has to look a certain way, you need to wear makeup. And so what happens in LGBTQI relationships is people don't necessarily fit into those boxes specifically. They may not recognize or identify with this quote unquote masculine men that is often being socialized, or this very feminine submissive woman that's being socialized. There might be two men in a relationship and there might be two women in a relationship, and there's not in that in relationship, there's not a woman in that relationship. So what does that look like? How do they navigate that when society has told them there needs to be a woman somewhere involved in here? Sometimes LGBTQI people get like asked like, well, who's the man in the relationship? Who's the woman in the relationship? Even though the point of, for myself being in a lesbian relationship, the point is that there is no man. So neither of us are the man, and neither of us take on that quote unquote role to fill, because we're able to navigate our relationship without that stereotype, without that socialization.
Yeah. Oh, I just wanted to add that, like, when I've done presentations with folks around gender identities, I usually ask, like, what are some of the characteristics you usually hear identify as masculine versus feminine? And there's a lot of like strong, protector, this, that, and the other under the masculine. And then I'm like, how many of you came from a single mother household? Like, how many of you had a strong female role model? Like, and then on the other side, like nurturing, caring, can cook. I've had like, they cook, they do this or that. And I'm like, how many of you that are in cis hetero relationships want to be with someone who's never going to cook? Or, you know what I mean? Like, it's kind of ridiculous because none of us actually fall into these roles specifically anyways. And so just like allowing people to be able to be fluid in who they are throughout their lifespan is like a really affirming thing to do, around how I think we should be engaging with people around gender norms in different ways.
I just want to add that I feel like whenever a person is kind of forced to be cast into the role of being the more submissive one, they can kind of feel like they have to accept abuse from partners when they don't have to. Like they should of course like stand up for themselves and everything. But
yeah, I think that's what was coming to mind for me too, is one of the more like insidious things that happens with this assumption is that then people like same-sex couples, that there isn't that same power imbalance. So there's not the expectation that one is dominant and one is submissive. So then intimate partner violence can't exist because you're equal, like things are spread equally, which makes it so much more dangerous to report intimate partner violence, because there's already that inherent thing of I'm not going to be believed because of who my partner is, or the fact that like, for example, I think about me and my fiance, like the fact that there is no man in the relationship could potentially make it harder to say, hey, I'm being abused, because people assume like, oh, you're two people that identify as women. You can't abuse each other. It must be even. It must be equal. And it just minimizes and makes it so much harder to get help in that sense.
Yeah, there have even been cases where sometimes police will arrest the more masculine or traditionally masculine presenting person, even if they're not the person who is doing the abuse. These gender norms say, well, they appear more masculine, therefore they must be more aggressive, or they must be more dominant, or they must have more control or power in that relationship. So even if it's not an explicit thing like somebody's thinking, these messages get communicated to us and they affect how we understand ourselves and think of ourselves, but also how service providers work with LGBTQIA plus people. If somebody who identifies as non-binary comes into an office and the person doesn't understand them, they're like, well, how could you be abused? You look like a man, but you say you're non-binary. And that can be really disheartening for the person who wants to receive those services, and also really minimizing of their experiences when somebody's like, I don't understand you as a person. you don't fit my ideas of who a victim is. You don't fit my ideas of who is somebody who needs these services. And that can be another reason why folks stay silent, is it's the, I don't want to be judged. I don't want to have to explain why I am the way I am, because it's just who I am. So oftentimes, sometimes LGBTQIA folks get silenced because they don't want to deal with that outside oppression, even from people who might mean well, even from that service provider who might mean well, but just doesn't have the education to understand somebody who doesn't fit into that binary.
Yeah, and how even that can impact self-perception, because I think about like I'm Latina, so I come from like a Mexican background, and there's a lot of messages around what you should be like as a woman, and how the intersection of those messages and the intersection of gender, and now being in a relationship where there's intimate partner violence, having to see for yourself like where you fit in that, how that fits for your worldview and your values, especially if you're feeling isolated, all of those things that can really compound and impact your willingness to seek out help, because you're already in a position that's dangerous and scary, and it even doesn't fit with your own worldview of how you saw yourself, so only making it even more difficult.
I love that you mentioned that. Thank you for sharing that.
Mhm.
As a Black queer woman, like I'll just share that I was in an intimate relationship where there was violence for like 10 years. And as a Black person, like we were taught to like never even call the police. And if they even came to knock on the door, like act like you're not even home or whatever. So like it was really hard to try to think about, where am I supposed to get support when these things are happening, and then to seek out that support one time, and then because it was a lesbian relationship, them not recognizing it as intimate partner violence and more as like a roommate dispute, I guess is what they considered, even though they got calls from all over the building, right? Nothing happened. Like I was not supported. Then the person was more angry at me because of that happening, and I wasn't in a safe position. So I also think like, depending on someone's racial or ethnic background, that also impacts how often or how much support they might seek out if they are in a domestic violence situation or intimate relationship violence situation.
Thank you all. So most victims of domestic violence, regardless of their sexuality or gender, experience a pattern of abuse where one partner will use different controlling behaviors. We call it sometimes coercive control. So trying to gain power and control over their partner. But queer and trans victims and survivors experience additional dynamics and barriers. Some of the things that you're talking about with barriers to maybe other people identifying or even themselves identifying it as domestic violence, or some systemic barriers and receiving help. But what are some of the ways that an abusive person might weaponize their partner's gender identity or sexuality in the abusive relationship?
I was gonna say the easiest thing I can point to is outing you. Like it was like, I'll out you at work, I'll out you to your family. Everyone's gonna know, and you're gonna lose everyone but me. Those kinds of things are can be really detrimental, especially around your like work, and especially for trans identified folks in the workforce. Like that is a huge concern. So I think that's one way that is weaponized.
Yeah, another one has to do with this idea of community. Sometimes LGBTQIA communities can feel very small just because statistically it's generally a smaller group than heterosexual people or maybe cisgender folks. So it's this idea of uh, if I seek help for an abuse that's going on in my relationship, I might not only end the relationship that I'm in, but I might end relationships with other people that I depend on for support. I might lose friends that both of us share mutually because they might believe this other person and not me. And unfortunately, sometimes people who are abusive will use that. They'll say, oh, well, your friends aren't going to believe you. They're going to believe me because of X, I, Z, or whatever it might be. I'll start rumors about you. I'll tell our friends things about you, and they'll, never want to talk to you again. So using a community against the person who's being hurt is sometimes something that can happen because it's a way for the person who's being abusive to get that power and control. If you can take away someone's social support, that's a huge thing that folks who are abusive do, because it isolates somebody and it makes somebody feel invisible and silent.
I think something else that can be used too is using like transphobic, homophobic, biphobic language to continue lowering someone's self-esteem, because that is a way to keep someone within the relationship. Like if you can convince them that nobody else is going to want them because of the way that they are, then they're going to stay with you because it's scarier to be alone. And so using those slurs and putting their partner down in a way that has already been historically painful to keep that leverage in the relationship.
I'll add that refusing to respect pronouns or your chosen name, or even your just an identity as a whole.
Yeah, it's that shaming of somebody, making somebody feel bad about who they are as a person, who they are as an individual, which can already be a very sensitive topic for somebody. As LGBTQI folks routinely, often, I'll just say in my experience in Texas, I routinely have normalized those really heteronormative messages about relationships. And so even though I'm proud of my identity now, that hasn't always been the case. So sometimes folks will use those kinds of things against you, or use some of those maybe internalized feelings that you have about yourself against somebody. And then there's also a legal component too. Sometimes LGBTQI relationships aren't viewed in the same legal sense as others. So maybe the threat is, these kids aren't biologically yours. I'll take the kids. I'll have rights over them. You'll never get to see them again. Even though those children might have both of these individuals from birth, maybe depending on who the person is who birthed them, they might use that as a way to say, well, I'll take the kids away, so you can't leave because you'll never see them again.
Thank you. So there are many reasons why survivors may not report abuse to others, and y'all have touched on a couple. But what are some additional reasons why somebody may not choose to report the abuse, either to others or not formally report to, like law enforcement may not seek help from a domestic violence agency?
I think a big one, again, this is probably one of the most common ones that comes to all our minds, is that threat of being out, that threat of having to reveal something. Maybe for folks who have been sexually assaulted, they don't want to go to the hospital because they don't want to have to deal with maybe somebody seeing their body, or somebody finding out that they're non-binary or trans or intersex or whatever it might be. Maybe it's the fear of having to present an ID to somebody that doesn't match their gender identity. So maybe the biological sex is different on that ID than how they understand their body and their gender identity and their sex. Maybe it's the fear that service providers won't understand or won't accept them, or maybe can't even accommodate them because of that sexual orientation or gender identity. Oftentimes there's been cases where shelters will turn away trans women because they are not that biological woman that society kind of often uplifts over trans women. So oftentimes it's that fear of, will I be able to get services? Will they understand? Will I be treated as a person, or will I be seen as somebody who is inherently different?
Yeah, I think on a more, everything that you just said, Sarah, I think what's popping up for me around something that you mentioned is like around the medical component and the legal aspect of it, as well as the services. But as a queer person, I have had to educate every medical provider I've had about stats around being a lesbian, stats around this or that. I don't believe that my like primary care physician knows that much if they had a transgender client for them for primary care. So I think there's also like this, they're not going to understand on top of me having trauma right now and dealing with that and those emotions. I'm going to have to educate them on, it feels like, I don't want to say a hassle, but it just feels like I can continue doing what I'm doing rather than having to go through all of these things. And also not being sure whether or not you'll be believed. And for folks who identify as trans, like there could be a difference between how they identify and what's on their driver's license, right? And so like that's a huge concern for folks. I know when they're getting pulled over or anything like that is, it creates a fear point around engaging with law enforcement. And so thinking about trying to exit a dangerous situation on top of that fear is a little bit hard and challenging for some people because they don't feel like the supports are there. And definitely all of our organizations across the country around sexual assault and intimate partner violence, like need to be thinking more about how to accommodate folks that are a member of this community because of like shelter situations. Like there's not always places for these folks to go, or there's not safe place. The people that they might be sheltering with might further harm them because they don't agree with them being there. So there's like there's a whole situation there where we need to like be educating and advocating for a little bit more progressive reform in our organization.
And if you hold more than one marginalized identity, it can be fear for your life. Like reporting this to someone could also mean that you could end up dead because of who shows up or how that's received or how they perceive you as a threat potentially. So having to be between a rock and a hard place of, is this the way that I consider life or death, or is this the call that I make that could also result in life or death because my humanity is not recognized?
Yeah, and when y'all were talking, it made me also think of the social support network. If you come from a home maybe where family isn't accepting and then you're in an abusive relationship and you don't have close friends in the community, where are you going to go? There is no place to go. If you're in an abusive relationship, oftentimes there's aspects of financial control and isolation. So if you can't go back to a family because they've disowned you or have said, don't come back here because of how you are, if you don't have friends who understand, if you don't have friends in the community in general, it can be like, I literally have no option but to stay here because this is my home and this is the only place where I feel like I can be me, even under an oppressive person who's being abusive.
Yeah, it sounds like y'all are talking about all the layers of trauma. Like somebody may be experiencing trauma in their, in their relationship, but then they're having to kind of balance the scales of like, is this kind of known situation better than maybe the unknown of what might happen if I try to seek help and access these services? And I think there's a lot of fear and like systemic mistrust of medical care, mental health services. Like there's a long history of, psychology and fields related endorsing things like conversion therapy. And so, of course, people may be skeptical of like, maybe they have either heard stories of other people that they know or experienced that directly from a mental health provider or somebody in a medical field. So thank you all for speaking to some of those barriers. We're nearing the end of our time, and I'd love to talk about like what can others learn from LGBTQ plus communities?
This is just like a little cutesy one. It's not like theoretic or anything, but I feel like the queer and trans folks I know, like we have had to undergo like a self-exploration that is different than folks who don't identify in this community at all, which makes, not to root us in resilience, but like it makes us pretty like, I don't know, rooted in ourselves, like in a little bit resilient, like to be like, I'm being who I am no matter what, is truly like a gift. And so just like really appreciate this community rather than ridiculing, and that there's a lot that can be learned, especially from the BIPOC folks in leadership within the LGBTQIA plus communities. I think that's what I would say.
I feel like something else that can be learned is kind of moving away from the need to put things in boxes. I think that's something that's so beautiful about our community is there's so much flexibility to let someone be who they want to be, how they want to be, and to let that be something that changes and evolves without it being something that anybody else holds against them. So being okay with not knowing and not having things in a neat little box, because that's a hard thing to come to, but it can be so liberating when you come out of the space of needing to attach a label to someone.
Yeah, and I would say another one is just empathy. Often as LGBTQIA folks, we've either experienced prejudice, oppression, discrimination ourselves, or have known people who have experienced it, or have heard people just being discriminatory or prejudicial just in our daily lives. I mean, if you go on the internet, I don't even know, even to this day, I don't know how many times I see the word gay being used as a slur to describe something that is stupid, unnecessary, feminine, or weak, or other words that are used as slurs. So, you know, have that empathy. Even though you may not understand somebody, even though you may not fully be able to experience their lives or understand them, have that empathy. Try to understand them, do some research, read books by people who are LGBTQIA, do those things. As Kitsia was kind of saying, do a little bit of self-research, self-understanding. We don't have to understand everybody to know that people deserve basic human rights and people don't deserve to be hurt in any way, shape, or form. At the end of the day, we are just people. We, put on our shoes the same exact way, to use that kind of dated slur or that dated statement. We do things the exact same way. Our relationships might look different. We might look different, but we're still people. Point blank, and we still deserve that respect and that compassion, that empathy, and services that help us when we need help.
Preach, Sarah.
Is there anything that we haven't covered today that you think is important?
I think Sarah touched on this around like the queer communities focus on like creating community, but it was just one of the last things I was thinking that people could learn from us is like an expanded view of what family looks like. You can really look to us for that because it's a beautiful thing.
Oh, so there was a question of what are some local businesses that are supportive of queer communities, and is there a list out there somewhere? So I will put a link in the chat. That's a pretty good place to find like places that have built into their systems protections for LGBTQIA people and LGBTQIA equality. But I think one of the best ways to do it is just like Google in your local community, like LGBTQIA owned businesses. I think Instagram has been a huge uprise of creating these very easily digestible guides on like queer businesses that you can support, small businesses that are queer that you can support, the intersectionality of Black and Indigenous people of color and queer businesses. So I'll put that link in there, and I think it can be transferred over, but also Google can be one of your best friends when it comes to that.
I was going to share because I'm on the Pride Planning Committee for the one in Denton, that there are a number of local businesses and organizations that support LGBTQ identified folks. So I put the link into our chat for the Pride Denton sponsorship page. So this is the 2020 sponsorship page, but our 2021 one should be up like probably this week or on Monday. And so that's a good way to check out the local organizations that are doing so. I would say that during 2019, we had a night out on the square where we asked local businesses to like do the Philly Rainbow and create giveaways. It was kind of like a pride parade in reverse. Instead of there being floats down the street, people went shop to shop, which people love to do in Denton anyways. And so you might be able to see right now that there are some businesses already that have started doing that this year. And so just knowing that like we've had conversations with them and that they're invested in the leadership of Pride Denton as well, which is primarily BIPOC, is helpful in a local way. So check out Pride Denton if you want to know more about local businesses in Denton that support LGBTQ identified folks.
Any last thoughts? Anything that we haven't covered yet that you think is important? You don't want to end the conversation without mentioning it? Anything that you hope that the listeners take away?
I think for me, and this is more like on a personal note, I think when we were going back to talking about what others can learn from the LGBTQA community is that we aren't born, nobody is born experts on anything. And as science updates, as we learn more about people's identities, even people in the LGBTQI community do research to help understand people in their community. Just because I identify as one way doesn't mean that I understand what it's like to be a transgender person or a non-binary person or an intersex person or an asexual person, right? So part of that, as I said, was going back, is that empathy, being able to understand somebody, even if they're not like you, even if they have different preferences, they love somebody who's different, they identify as a different way, being able to understand that they're a human being and they deserve the same things that heterosexual cisgender folks do. And I think that would just kind of be my takeaway, is that at the end of the day, we all deserve love, love is love, all those hashtags, all those great things. And of course, uplifting the voices of people of the global majority and BIPOC folk.
All right, well, we have 1 minute left. Camion, you were unmuting. Did you have something you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, just like in the spirit of what we're talking about, just want to affirm to all the queer and trans folks out there that might be watching or might watch this later, that you are an amazing person, no matter how you identify. You deserve the good things in life, all of the joys that you can get. And you deserve to be in healthy, thriving relationships, whether they're intimate ones or friendships or family ones, whatever. So just kind of root in that. And please keep an eye out, everyone, and support our local city council in creating a non-discrimination ordinance that provides protections for our community members who are queer and trans. We need to push for that.
All right, well, thank you all. It's right at 2 o'clock, so great use of our time, and that's a great note to end on. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll catch you next time here on Facebook Live.